Happy birthday, sir.
Thank you, Chichi.
The door swung open before the guard could stop her. A little girl walked into the grand hall of the Seoul penthouse, and every conversation in the room died at once. She could not have been older than 8. Her skin was dark against the white marble floor, her hair braided neatly into 2 puffs, and in her small arms she carried something folded with the kind of care you only give to something precious. A men's suit, wrapped in plain brown paper, tied with a simple ribbon. She was Nigerian, she was black, and she was without question the only child in a room full of Seoul's most dangerous men. Nobody moved. A waiter froze mid-step, a tray of champagne trembling in his hands. 2 bodyguards near the entrance exchanged a look, unsure whether to grab her or simply stare. Somewhere near the back, an old man in a navy suit set down his glass slowly, as if any sudden motion might shatter the moment. The girl didn't flinch. She didn't look around for her parents. She didn't cry or freeze or turn back. She walked calm, deliberate, small feet moving with a confidence that made no sense for someone her size in a room like this, straight toward the man standing at the center of it all. Kang Tae-Hyun. If you don't know that name yet, you will by the end of this story. Stay with us, because what this little girl was about to hand him would set into motion something far bigger than either of them understood. And if stories like this move you, hit subscribe now, because you don't want to miss where this one goes. Tae-Hyun turned as the room's silence reached him. He was not a man easily surprised. He had built an empire out of silence and precision, out of never needing to raise his voice for people to obey him. He looked down at the child standing in front of him, unbothered by his height, his reputation, or the 6 armed men in the room who could end a person's life without changing their expression. She held the package up to him with both hands. "Happy birthday, sir." For a moment, nobody in the room breathed. Then Tae-Hyun crouched down, an act that stunned the room more than the girl's entrance had, and accepted the gift with both hands, the way you'd accept something from an elder, not a child. He smiled. It was the first time in years that anyone in that room had seen him smile like that. To understand how a Nigerian child ended up in the middle of a Korean crime boss's birthday party, you have to go back. Not far back, just far enough. Her name was Chidinma, though everyone at home simply called her Kai. Her father Emeka was a chef in Lagos, known in his neighborhood for turning almost nothing into a feast. Her mother Ngozi ran a small tailoring business from their front room, a sewing machine, a wall of fabric scraps, and a reputation for making clothes fit like they were poured onto the body. Kai grew up on the floor beside that sewing machine. While other children played outside, she sat cross-legged watching her mother's hands move, pinning, cutting, adjusting, correcting. "Mummy, why did you cut it there?" she asked one afternoon, no older than 5. Ngozi didn't look up from the fabric. "Because the man who will wear this has shoulders wider than his waist. If I cut it straight, it will hang wrong." "How do you know his shoulders are wider?" "I looked at him, Kai, that's all. You look and the fabric tells you the rest." Kai looked too, and somehow impossibly she began to see it the same way her mother did. She'd glance at a customer walking through the market and whisper measurements under her breath, and more often than not she was right. It was a talent nobody had planned for. It simply grew quietly, the way real skill does, one afternoon at a time. Everything changed the year Emeka got the call. An international recruitment agency hired by a wealthy Korean household was searching across 3 continents for a private chef, someone who could cook not just Korean food but French, Italian, Nigerian, whatever the household's frequent international guests required. Emeka had been recommended by a former employer. He didn't apply directly. He was found. "They want to fly me to Korea for an interview," he told Ngozi that night, sitting at their small kitchen table. "Korea," Ngozi repeated. "Emeka, that is not down the street." "I know," he reached for her hand. "But if I pass this, Ngozi, this changes everything for us, for Kai. And if you fail, then we come home, nothing lost but a plane ticket we didn't pay for." She was quiet for a long moment, watching their daughter asleep on the mat in the corner, thumb near her mouth, a scrap of fabric still clutched in her small fist from the day's sewing lesson. "Then you will not fail," Ngozi finally said. He didn't. The interview process was rigorous. 3 rounds of cooking assessments, a background check, a formal evaluation by the household staff director. Emeka cooked jollof rice beside French confit and Korean banchan in the same afternoon, and by the end of it, the recruiter shook his hand with something like relief. "Congratulations, Mr. Emeka. The employer would like to proceed with relocation." 3 months later, the family boarded a plane out of Lagos with 2 suitcases, a sewing machine left behind out of necessity, and a child who pressed her face to the window the entire flight, watching clouds she'd never imagined she'd see from above. Seoul greeted them with more glass and steel than Kai had ever seen in her life. The relocation package the agency arranged gave them a modest but comfortable apartment, transportation during the transition, and enough support that the family never once felt stranded in a country where they knew no one. "This is ours?" Kai asked, standing in the small living room spinning slowly to take it all in. "For now," Ngozi said, "as long as your father does well." "He always does well." Ngozi smiled and pulled her daughter close. "Yes, he does." Emeka began work almost immediately. Private chef to a man the household staff spoke of carefully, almost reverently, never by his full title, only by his name, Kang Tae-Hyun. The residence was enormous, guarded, and quiet in a way that made Kai's skin prickle the first time her father brought her along after school, waiting in a small side room while he finished his shift. She caught her first glimpse of Tae-Hyun through a cracked door, a tall man in an impeccable charcoal suit, speaking softly to an assistant, every motion controlled, deliberate. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. The room bent around him without him lifting a finger. "Who is that man?" she whispered to her father on the walk home. "That's Mr. Kang," Emeka said carefully. "The man I work for. Be respectful when you see him, Kai. He is a very important man. He wears nice suits." Emeka laughed despite himself. "Yes, he does." Meanwhile, Ngozi refused to let her hands sit idle. She saved carefully from the small allowance Emeka's position provided, and within a year she'd bought a second-hand sewing machine from a shop 2 subway stops away. It wasn't much. It rattled when it ran too long and needed oil every other week, but it was hers and it was enough. Kai resumed her place on the floor beside it, older now, sharper-eyed, her hands steadier. "Mummy, can I try the sleeve?" "You tried the last sleeve. You put the seam on the wrong side." "I won't this time." Ngozi studied her daughter, really studied her, the way she once studied fabric. "All right, show me." Kai didn't get it wrong that time, or the next. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't scroll past without hitting that like button. It genuinely helps this story reach more people, and trust me, we haven't even gotten to the part that will break your heart open. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from tonight. The months passed quietly. Emeka worked long hours at the residence, sometimes staying overnight when Tae-Hyun hosted late dinners for business associates. Kai began accompanying him more often after school let out, sitting in the staff kitchen doing homework while pots simmered around her. The household staff grew used to her, the small girl with the neat braids who greeted everyone by name and never once complained about waiting. One afternoon, an assistant named Jaiwon found her sketching quietly on a scrap of paper. "What are you drawing?" Kai held it up shyly. It was a rough outline of a jacket, the lines uneven, but the proportions oddly, unmistakably correct. "For who?" "Nobody yet," Kai said. "I just like to draw them." Jaiwon studied the sketch a moment longer than necessary before handing it back. "You have a good eye." "My mummy taught me." It was around that time the household began preparing for Tae-Hyun's birthday. It wasn't a large public affair, no press, no spectacle. Just a private gathering of the people closest to him, senior associates, a handful of longtime friends, people whose loyalty had been tested and proven over years. There was no tradition requiring gifts. People came simply to share a meal, a drink, and rare, unguarded time with a man who gave little of himself away. Kai learned about the birthday from overhearing the kitchen staff. "Mummy," she said that evening, sitting at their small dinner table, "it's Mr. Kang's birthday soon." Ngozi glanced up from stirring the pot. "Is that so?" "I want to make him something." Ngozi set the spoon down slowly. Kai, do you understand who this man is? He is not like the customers I sew for in the market." "I know. He is a very serious, very important man. If we make something and it isn't good enough." "It will be good enough." Kai's voice was steady in a way that startled her mother. I've been watching you my whole life, Mummy. I know what I'm doing. Emeka, sitting quietly at the end of the table, finally spoke. Let her try, Ngozi. If it isn't right, we simply don't give it. No harm done. Ngozi looked at her daughter for a long moment, the same steady, determined face she'd worn since she was old enough to hold a needle, and sighed. Fine, but you listen to me on the difficult parts. No arguing. No arguing, Kai agreed, already reaching for the fabric bin. They didn't buy new material. There was no money for that, and even if there had been, Kai didn't want it. She dug through the scraps saved from months of her mother's work, offcuts too small for a full garment, remnants left over from other projects, pieces most tailors would have thrown away. She laid 5 colours across the floor. A deep charcoal, a burgundy, a muted gold, a rich forest green, and a sliver of ivory for the lining. 5 colours is a lot for one suit, Ngozi warned. If you don't balance it right, it will look like a costume. I won't let it look like a costume. For the next 2 weeks, their small living room became a workshop every evening after dinner. Kai cut the pattern herself, correcting twice when the proportions ran wide. Ngozi guided her through the collar construction, the parts too technical for small hands alone, but stepped back whenever Kai insisted she could manage. Not that way, Ngozi said one night, watching her daughter struggle with a lapel seam. Here, like this. She guided Kai's fingers gently. Feel how the fabric wants to fold, don't force it, let it. Kai tried again, the fold sat clean. There, Ngozi said softly, you see. I see, Kai grinned, exhausted, thread caught in her braids. By the final night, the suit sat finished across their small table, a 2-piece jacket and trousers set, the 5 colours woven through the lining and collar in a pattern that shouldn't have worked and somehow did. Bold, unusual, undeniably elegant. Ngozi held it up to the light, turning it slowly, searching for a flaw. She didn't find one. Kai, she said quietly, this is beautiful. You helped. I guided, you made it. Ngozi folded it carefully into brown paper, tying it with a plain ribbon because that was all they had. Are you sure about this? Kai nodded, already halfway to the door in her mind, already picturing the room she'd have to walk into. I'm sure, Mummy. The night of the birthday, Emeka was pulled into the kitchen hours early, buried under the demands of a 12-course dinner service. Ngozi had a delivery to finish for another customer and couldn't leave, which meant that when Kai slipped out of the staff entrance with the wrapped suit in her arms, nobody noticed. Nobody stopped her. She walked the long hallway toward the main hall alone, past security who recognized her as the chef's daughter and assumed she was simply passing through, and pushed open the door to a room full of the most dangerous men in Seoul. You already know what happened next. The silence, the stares, the walk no one interrupted, the words that stopped an entire room cold. Happy birthday, sir. And Kang Tae-Hyun, a man who trusted almost no one completely, took the gift from a child's hands like it was the most natural thing in the world. Later that night, long after the guests had gone, Tae-Hyun sat alone in his private study and finally unwrapped the package properly. He lifted the jacket free of the paper and turned it over in his hands, studying the stitching, the collar, the unusual, deliberate blend of 5 colours that had no business working together and somehow did. He put it on. It fit, not adequately, not approximately, but precisely in a way his own tailor's suits, cut from measurements taken twice a year, rarely managed. He studied himself in the mirror for a long time. His assistant, Jae-won, knocked and entered with a folder of documents, then stopped short at the sight of him. Sir, that's not one of your usual suits. No, Tae-Hyun said quietly, it isn't. Where did it come from? He didn't answer right away. He was still looking at the reflection, at the strange, quiet pull the burgundy and gold trim had on something in his memory he couldn't quite name. Find the girl who gave me this, he finally said. Jae-won hesitated, the little one, the chef's daughter. Find her. If this story has you sitting up a little straighter, make sure you're subscribed, because what Tae-Hyun discovers next is going to change how you see this entire story, and we're only about halfway there. Kai was found the next afternoon, sitting quietly in the staff kitchen with her homework spread across the table, entirely unaware that a man 3 floors up had spent the morning staring at a suit she'd made him. Jae-won crouched to her eye level. Kai, Mr. Kang would like to see you. Emeka, standing nearby, went still, Is something wrong? Did she do something? No, Jaiwon said gently. Nothing's wrong, he just wants to speak with her. Emeka walked his daughter up personally, his hand tight around hers, his mind racing through every possible reason a man like Tae-Hyun would summon a child. When they entered the study, Tae-Hyun was standing by the window, still wearing the suit. He turned, looked at Kai, then simply asked, "Who made this?" Kai didn't hesitate. "It's me, sir." "You made it yourself." "My mummy helped with the hard parts, but I designed it. I chose the colors, I cut it." Tae-Hyun studied her, really studied her, the way you study something you don't yet understand but recognize as significant. "Why 5 colors?" Kai thought about it seriously, the way a much older person might. "Because you always wear one color, sir, black or grey or navy. I thought maybe you'd like something that felt like more than one thing at once." The room went very quiet. Emeka opened his mouth, ready to apologize for whatever his daughter had just said, certain it had somehow overstepped. But Tae-Hyun only nodded slowly, something unreadable passing behind his eyes. "That's a strange thing for a child to notice. My mummy says I have a good eye." "She's right." He turned back toward the window, quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had changed, softer, almost distracted. "Where did your mother learn to sew like this?" "Nigeria, sir. She learned from a woman in our neighborhood a long time ago, before I was born." Something in Tae-Hyun's posture shifted, small but unmistakable. He didn't explain it, not yet. "Thank you, Kai, he said instead. "You may go." That night, alone in his study again, Tae-Hyun sat with the suit draped over his knee, running his thumb along the collar's inner seam, a particular stitch pattern along the lapel fold that he hadn't seen since he was a boy. A pattern his own grandmother used to point out on old garments in a trunk nobody was allowed to touch. He told himself it was a coincidence. He didn't believe it. Weeks passed. True to the promise he'd made to himself, Tae-Hyun didn't return to the family's apartment. He didn't summon Kai again, didn't hover, didn't turn the moment into something repeated and hollow. Instead, quietly, without ceremony, he arranged one thing. A legitimate commission for Ngozi through a respected fashion house he had connections to, a real opportunity, evaluated on the merit of her work alone, not handed to her out of pity. "They want to see 6 pieces, Ngozi told Emeka that evening, staring at the formal letter in disbelief. "A full evaluation. If they like the work, they'll carry my designs in their boutique." "That's incredible, Ngozi." "It's a chance, nothing more." But her hands were trembling as she folded the letter carefully into her sewing box, next to the spool of burgundy thread left over from Kai's suit. Tae-Hyun did not call to check on her progress. He did not visit. He simply opened the door and stepped back, exactly as he told himself he would. But the suit stayed with him, worn quietly on occasions he chose deliberately, not flaunted, not explained, just present. And it was at one such occasion, a formal gathering of associates from across the region, that a man who had known Tae-Hyun for over 20 years leaned in during a quiet moment and said, "That's different from what you normally wear." Tae-Hyun didn't look up from his glass. "Yes." "Who made it?" A pause, then simply, "Someone I know." The man studied him a moment longer, sensing there was more beneath the answer, but he knew Tae-Hyun well enough not to push. He let it go. But Tae-Hyun couldn't let it go so easily himself. That stitch pattern haunted him. He began quietly investigating, not through his usual channels of intimidation and leverage, but carefully, respectfully, the way you handle something fragile. He had an old associate in trade circles trace the origins of the technique, and what came back stunned him. Decades earlier, before Tae-Hyun was born, his grandfather, then a young man building the first threads of what would become the family's business, had spent a year in West Africa establishing trade relationships. During that year, he'd befriended a struggling tailor in Lagos, a woman with extraordinary skill and no capital to grow her small shop. Quietly, without fanfare, his grandfather had helped her, connected her to fabric suppliers, vouched for her with early clients, given her the foothold she needed to build something lasting. That woman had gone on to train apprentices of her own for the rest of her life. One of those apprentices, decades later, had trained a young Ngozi. Tae-Hyun sat with the documents spread across his desk long into the night, the suit hanging on a stand beside him, and understood, finally, why the collar's stitch pattern had stopped him cold the very first time he'd seen it. It wasn't coincidence. It was a thread, quiet, invisible, unbroken, stretching from his grandfather's small act of kindness in a country he'd visited once, decades before Tae-Hyun was born, all the way to a little girl who had walked fearlessly into his birthday party with a gift in her hands. Ngozi didn't know. Kai certainly didn't know. Neither of them had any idea that the skill passed hand to hand, generation to generation, carried a history reaching back into his own family. He sat with that for a long time. It would have been easy, expected, even in his world, to use that discovery. To make it about legacy, about debt, about ownership. To insert himself into the family's life as something more than what he'd already quietly become. He chose not to. Instead, he closed the file, locked it away, and let the moment remain what it was, a private understanding that changed nothing about how he'd already decided to act. He had already given the one thing he intended to give. He wasn't going to turn it into a chain around anyone's neck. Months later, Ngozi's designs were accepted into the boutique, not out of favour. Not because anyone pulled strings on her behalf beyond the introduction itself. The fashion house evaluated her work blind, compared it against dozens of other submissions, and chose hers because it stood on its own. Her small collection sold out within its first week. Emeka continued his work at the residence, steady and respected, his reputation growing quietly among the household's frequent guests. And Kai kept sitting on the floor beside her mother's machine most evenings, sketching, cutting, correcting her own mistakes with the same patient determination she'd always had. Tae-Hyun never told them what he'd discovered. He never visited again to explain it, never used the knowledge to draw the family closer into his world, never let the story become something it was never meant to be. Some things, he understood now, mean more left exactly as they are, a debt quietly repaid across a distance of decades, without anyone needing to know the ledger had ever existed. One evening, months after all of it, Kai sat on the floor of their apartment with a new sketch in front of her, the hum of her mother's sewing machine steady in the background. "Mummy," she said, looking up, "I have an idea." Ngozi glanced over, thread still between her fingers. "What idea?" Kai looked back down at the fabric in her lap, a deep charcoal, edged with a thin strip of burgundy she'd saved specifically for this. Something different. She began working. Her mother watched her a moment longer, smiling at something she couldn't quite name, pride, maybe, or the quiet recognition that whatever she'd started years ago, sewing alone in a small room in Lagos, was still moving forward, still growing, still being carried by small, steady hands into whatever came next. Somewhere across the city, in a study far more expensive than anything either of them would ever set foot in, a suit hung carefully on its stand, 5 colours, 1 stitch pattern, and a story neither of them would ever fully know. But it didn't need to be known to matter. It only needed to have happened. If this story moved you even a little, don't scroll away without leaving a comment telling us what part stayed with you the most, and hit subscribe so you're here for the next one, because there are so many more stories like this one waiting to be told. Thank you for staying until the end.